They're trying to start World War III. So, the rest of this video is, I guess, just going to be justifying that statement. Now, first of all, who is they? Well, after an hour and a half of recording time so far, I have decided that I am not going to try to answer that question, except to say that when I say they, I'm not referring to any particular person or even a group of people. I think when I say they, I'm referring to the general decision-making apparatus or structure that exists within, this empire that we live in that allows it to make decisions and, determine what it's going to do. There has to be some structure that allows it to choose what to do because it does things. And so whatever that is, that's what I mean when I say they. Now, when I say this empire, what am I referring to? I, again, am not going to explain what I mean by that. This, I think for obvious reasons, is certainly at least one video's worth, of content all on its own, if not a series worth. So I think that I will try to organize my thoughts on, this empire and trying to explain what I mean when I'm referring to this empire. But I can't do that today because I'm trying to not make an hour and a half long video. The only thing I'll say about this empire is that I'll generally refer to it as the Western Empire because I feel like referring to it as the U.S. military or the U.S. empire isn't the most, useful or accurate. I think it's more useful to say that there is a Western empire of the Western world with the United States at its heart. That's all I'll say on that. So, why are they trying to start World War III? Why is the Western Empire, or, the extension of the U.S. military, why World War III? Why? Well, that's a very good question because, in fact, for a long time, they've been trying very hard to keep World War III from happening. They've signed countless treaties and upkept them, diligently with Russia and all the other nuclear states to ensure that, World War III doesn't happen and these escalations don't proliferate into wide-scale wars, primarily because World War III isn't just war, it's nuclear war. When you've got 5,000 nukes and you're in a war for your life, you're going to use some of them. So, for understandable reasons, the Western Empire has actually been trying to keep World War III from happening. They've been trying to expand their imperial footprint. They've been trying to grow without World War III. They're trying to, as you've probably heard about and thought about yourself, they use proxy wars in a way that, states weren't fighting proxy wars 200 years ago the way that now, we talk about it all the time, and we understand that, for instance, Ukraine is a proxy war for the United States. We don't even need that told to us. We know that this is the United States trying to accomplish something through the Ukrainian military. So, if they have previously tried to keep World War III from happening, why would they be doing something different now? That's a very good question. The answer is the times change. My phone is shaking. Yo, it's shaking so much. So, the question remains, why now? Well, I actually wrote I wrote down some stuff. I even put pictures in there. I've got notes because I didn't want this to be unscripted. Because I didn't want this to be another hour and a halfer. So, if they've previously tried to prevent World War III from happening, why would they now be encouraging it or letting it happen or wanting it to happen? Well, I'll get to that. But first, I think what's more important for now is to see if they are. Because, we could debate, if they even are doing it on purpose, for instance. But if they are walking themselves into World War III, then that's very important. And if that's what's happening, then ultimately that's what the decision-making apparatus is doing. Whether or not there is anybody who thinks that's a good idea, if that's what the apparatus does, then that is the decision-making capability of the apparatus. So, are they letting World War III happen? Are they letting the World War III, are they letting So, let's turn to the active wars that are going on, because if World War III is going to start, history tells us it will start because a local war breaks out into a war that the whole world has to take sides on. So let's start with a war that the whole world is being forced to take sides on. And has been for 2 years, which is the Ukraine war. Which is the war in Ukraine, the war on Ukraine, the Ukrainian war, Ukraine-Russia war. So, if we're on the lookout for wars that might escalate into World War III, we might first look to the war in Ukraine. You and I, like I've said, recognize this as a proxy war between the United States and Russia, which just so happens to enlist the Ukrainian army instead of the United States army. And presumably, Russia feels the same way. Oh, actually, we have Putin on the line, so we could ask him directly. Mr. Putin, what do you think about the arms deliveries that the West has been giving to Ukraine lately? Do you think this is an escalation? Do you think this is tamping down temperatures? What do you have to say?
If this decision is taken, it will mean nothing less than the direct involvement of NATO countries, the United States and European countries in the war in Ukraine. This will be their direct participation, and this, of course, will significantly change the very essence, the very nature of the conflict. This will mean that NATO countries, the US and European countries are at war with Russia. And if this is so, meaning the essence of the conflict changed, we will take the respective decisions corresponding to the threats we are facing.
So that's a yes on escalation. So yes, in Ukraine, the West, for a little while, was saying that it didn't want to send, for instance, long-range missiles to Ukraine because they knew that this was a red line for Russia, and that if Ukraine was striking Russian territory with Western missiles, they would recognize that as a direct war between the West and Russia. And of course, in this clip, Putin is being as clear as he possibly can be in delivering the message that if NATO sends long-range missiles that strike Russia, NATO is at war with Russia, which means Russia will be at war with NATO. Everybody on the same page? So, it's very clear that actively the, Western alliance, the Western empire, is pushing this escalation forward. Putin, and they've known this, and Putin is saying that this is a red line. If you do this, there will be a direct escalation to all-out direct war between Russia and NATO. So the only thing we can think based on these actions is that the Western empire and imperial structure is intending for Russia to be put in this position where their red line is crossed and then they respond. It seems very clear that if Russia says, if you do this, there will be war, and the West is like, we're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. That means the West is choosing war with Russia. Okay, so maybe that's not World War III. Maybe that's just, an entire military bloc going to war against one country. That's not a world war. That's just a really lopsided war. That's that's what, they'd hope anyway. Well, that brings us, of course, to the next active conflict, which is probably more in the news these days, because, people don't like genocide. So the war in Israel, which sees Israel basically bombing Gaza to smithereens, and, seemingly Israel is intent on completing a genocide against the Palestinian people because, of course, the Israeli ideal has always been, from the river to the sea, an exclusively Jewish state. So obviously, if that state's going to take that idea seriously, that's going to be their goal, is to get all the Palestinians out. So it seems like that's what Israel's doing. So that's what Israel's doing. And along with that, Israel is directly provoking Iran, for instance, by airstriking the Iranian embassy in Lebanon, and then explosively assassinating the political leader, the negotiation leader of Hamas, literally the person that the Israelis are supposed to sit down with and negotiate. They killed him in Iran's capital on the day, or the day before? I think it was the day before the new Iranian president was to be sworn in. That sounds a little bit like intentional escalation. Obviously, that first strike that I mentioned, the Iranian consulate in Lebanon, was also an escalation against Lebanon and Hezbollah, which they've been escalating over and over and over and over again, including genuinely the most horrifying terrorist attack that's occurred in my lifetime. Because 9/11 was before I was born. But if you haven't been following the news, Israel and Israeli intelligence or whatever, they were able to sneak explosives into the pagers and walkie-talkies of seemingly like every Hezbollah member, and blew up pagers and walkie-talkies literally all over Lebanon.
Accountable. I've seen that.
One, I think, very reasonable take for those out there, a guy named John Robb, who I often look to. He says the reason the governments don't do this is it greenlights the booby trapping and sabotaging of civilian supply chains, electronics that explode, devolve into contaminated food and or water. And that's actually, frankly, what scares me the most. And part of the reason why I really wanted to flag this, of like, this is what modern war would look like. If you think about total war, almost every war of the 20th century, major conflict between nation states escalates into like a true do or die situation, especially if America were to ever get involved. Think about how compromised our supply chain is, how much we rely on exports. Even our own military often runs on stuff from afar. But then think about too, about the legitimacy of Target, allegedly like here in America, and like who would count for that? You and I could technically qualify like, oh, propagandists of the state, depending on whose definition. If somebody was in here and they happen to be one of those people, which is certainly possible, any of the supply or the transit networks that we take whenever we come here to work, you could just see how this could very clearly go crazy. And that is actually probably what I'm most afraid of, is watching the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, if you look at it, what do the Russians strike whenever they do missiles? It's not the civilian population. They're going after like energy centers and the power stations inside of Ukraine. With Hamas, Israel has mostly done that as well. But now with Hezbollah, you're giving these tainted pagers that have been exploited through some sort of supply chain. You're just blowing it up wherever you want. Same with these cheap, commercially available drones, which we're seeing all over the Russia-Ukraine war. A lot of them fall out of the sky and blow people up all the time. So this is what it's really going to look like. This is why war is a nightmare, and you should avoid it at all costs. And we're getting now 4K video of what it really looks like when you get your entire face blown off. Previously, at best, it's a government censor, let some guy write about it 2 years later. Like now you're seeing it 4K IRL, and that's really scary, honestly.
No, it's Pandora's box. Like it really is. They really are opening Pandora's box with this.
Yeah, all I can say is if that doesn't sound like intentional escalation, I don't know what could be. So, just taking that on its own, Israel is directly trying to escalate, very obviously trying to escalate with both Iran and Lebanon. In addition to that, every single country in the region, aside from Israel, has a population which is in majority Arab, Muslim people who just so happen to identify with the Muslim Arab people who are being genocided in Palestine. Which means that every single country in the region, their entire population basically, wants them to do something. Because, of course, the United States after World War III, the United States after World War II, talked a big game about how everything they did was justified because genocide, and America is the great savior of the world because genocide. And, these ideas penetrated the world because this was the worldwide justification for America being the superpower which had its boots on every continent except Antarctica. Unless you count scientist boots. There's probably a military base in Antarctica, I bet, even though it's illegal. So, these ideas that it is a state's responsibility to intervene on behalf of a genocided people. These ideas have permeated the entire world. And the Arab world, being countries, full of people who identify with the people in Palestine and also very close to the country of Palestine, and also these people generally these days feeling like they've had the boots, the Western boots on their neck their entire lives. It's very understandable that what they want from their governments is to do something about this, to do something about the genocide in Palestine. So there's the direct escalation of Israel on Iran and Lebanon, between Israel and Iran and Lebanon, but there's also an indirect escalation that is constantly happening as Israel continues to genocide the population of Palestine. There is an increased escalation, general escalation, an indirect escalation with all of the states in the region, even if they're aligned with the West, like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Jordan or Turkey. All of these states, they are full of people who care and who want something to happen, who would go fight and die to save Palestinians. These governments can't all just sit back and watch this happen forever. Particularly for these governments, not just when their population is upset about something Israel's doing, but when they feel genuinely threatened by things like For instance, the pager attack. That could happen in any country that Israel wanted to. You know, if there was a large, like the Houthis in Yemen, for instance, you know, if there's a large enough terrorist population in some country, or large enough anti-Israel group, militant group in any country, then that gives a justification for Israel to commit terrorist attacks on their populations. So these governments are not going to feel like they can just sit back and let things happen. So that all being said, on many counts in the, you know, war in Israel, you could say the Israeli war on life itself, there's escalation toward a wider regional war, which would undoubtedly bring the United States in directly, because Israel can barely maintain their fight against, well, they can maintain it, but they're barely even making progress in their fight against Hamas. You know, a lot of analysts seem weary about the idea of Israel even being able to fight Hezbollah with sustainability, because Hezbollah is not Hamas, who, you know, are basically a prison gang, because Gaza is an open-air prison and has been for 20 years. Another name for that is concentration camp, by the way. So, you know, a wider regional war of different states in the Middle East fighting Israel would undoubtedly bring the U.S. military in, because, again, the U.S. military has shown no interest in telling Israel, no, you can't do this, or saying, no, we won't supply you with the ability to, you know, genocide Palestinians or escalate against your neighbors. You know, we will put our foot down and say, no, you can't do this, in the same way they could in Ukraine. And so what's happening is that, at least on two fronts, there are active wars that the U.S. is, at the very least, allowing to spiral into almost guaranteed regional conflicts that will bring the U.S. and all of NATO, because again, if the U.S. enters a war, all of NATO is legally, however legally binding the NATO charter is, they are legally bound to also be involved in that war. We don't even need to talk about China in this segment, because I think those two cases are enough of, you know, a justification to say that definitely it is at least being consciously accepted by the decision-making apparatus that these escalations will continue without U.S. intervention to stop them. And of course, you know, if the U.S. is at war with Russia and the U.S. is at war with all of the Middle East, what does that mean? Well, of course, the U.S. is not just the U.S., it's an entire coalition. So just like how the Russia war would be Russia against the entire coalition of NATO, well, now we're proposing an entire coalition of Arab states against Israel and the U.S. and NATO. Now, the media will be very quick to tell you that Iran and Russia are backed up by China. Does that mean China will back them? Well, that's what the U.S. is worried about, isn't it? And I think that gets to the whole heart of the answer to the question of why now are they trying to start World War III? The answer to that question is that as the future, you know, as time continues, China is being increasingly put in a position to where they could sever themselves from the United States and float an opposing coalition. As far as the U.S. wargamers are concerned, if current trends go on too much, the U.S. economy declining and the Chinese economy continuing to expand and also continuing to become the heart of its own economic interdependence, if that continues, then China and this opposing economic bloc will be in a position, if an all-out military conflict occurs, to sustain and to withstand being cut off economically from the United States and from the West. And if that happened, that would be really bad, because can the US and the West sustain being cut off from China? As far as I'm aware, the answer already is no. And maybe the only thing that they're betting on is that the answer is still no for China. Maybe they're only betting on China, being able to wedge China out of that coalition so that it's Iran and Russia and the misfits. And they're not all backed up by the big brother. I was going to do a detailed 3-point breakdown where I said, there's a nuclear aspect to this, there's a military, strategic aspect to this in the Pacific and in the Arctic, and there's a, third economic aspect to this. And I could do that, but I think that it would be pointlessly long to just say that in all of these ways, in the nuclear arsenals, which, the United States has enjoyed their position previously, China is building their arsenal to become equals with the United States. They're not there yet, but they're trying to be equals. In the Pacific, the United States has enjoyed in Pacific, military naval dominance in the entire world. China has official goals to expand their naval domination in the Pacific, which is directly is an official counter to the official U.S. military, strategy or whatever, to say that the entire world's oceans are ours, basically. China says this first chain, and then this second chain, and this third chain. These are our goals for our own naval military hegemony. That's a threat to the United States if they establish that. They're not there yet. They're still working on the first island chain, which includes Taiwan as the biggest island, which is why all the time in the news you hear about how important Taiwan is. Taiwan. China's going to invade Taiwan. China wants military hegemony over Taiwan. The United States currently has military hegemony over Taiwan. China obviously doesn't feel safe with, an American military base 20 miles, 50 miles, I don't know how far, not very far off their coast. So this is another point to which the United States doesn't want Chinese, strategic development to continue before this war happens. And of course, the economic. If you don't know, since the collapse of the British sterling pound, the United States dollar has been the world reserve currency. And before 1971, the US dollar was based on the gold standard. And in 1971, they said, fuck that. We don't care how much gold we have. We have as much money as we have. And so from 1971 on, the US dollar has just been the world's reserve currency. And there is no bullion standard. There is no thing that says this is how much a dollar is worth. A dollar is this percentage of this much stuff. That doesn't exist anymore. And so US dollar is just worth whatever a US dollar is worth. And that's so because the US empire does what it does, because the US military exists where it does, and it allows US corporations to exist where it does, and it allows all these people and all these places and all these things that treat the US dollar as if it means something. All these places exist and and continually exist because of the expression of US empire, because we don't need to get into that. There are lots of videos that can describe it better than I can, because it's obviously very complicated. I don't know the specific details about it, of how it works, but what I do know is is that this, system of the US dollar just being worth whatever the US dollar is worth is based on the idea that the US dollar isn't gonna suddenly lose capacity. It's based on the idea that we all think a US dollar is worth something today, and we can all agree on that. And we can also agree that in the future, it's also going to be worth something. That's why previously, you would have like a gold standard, for instance, because it doesn't matter if the US dollar is worth anything, because that is directly related to an amount of gold, which we assume certainly is worth something. If there's no gold, it's just however much you assume the US dollar is worth. And if the US economy, for instance, is perceived as being on the decline, if it seems as if the US isn't a growing market and isn't economically stable, if the US starts, having large swings in its economy, if it starts showing brittleness, it won't be able to sustain as the US reserve or as the world reserve currency, because its position fundamentally relies on people assuming that it has a stable value. Long story short, the US economy is declining and the Chinese economy is rising. If the US economy continues to decline and begins to be perceived as unstable, it cannot be the world reserve currency. And again, I don't want to try to explain the details because it'll get too far into the weeds and I don't even know the weeds well enough to explain them to you. But if that happened, the entire US economy would collapse. The US government functions based on the idea that it can just print
money and it doesn't matter. We're taught the ideas of inflation, like, there's inflation, because if there's more money versus how much things there are, then there's more money to the things ratio, and so things are constant.
I'm getting too much into the weeds, and now I'm hitting a wall because I don't know how to explain it anymore. But long story short, the US government won't be able to print money and subsidize all of the industries and, of course, the world-spanning military empire that they possess. They won't be able to print money to sustain that anymore. And so, if the US waits for World War III until then, if the US waits for World War III and to the point where the US dollar collapses as the world reserve currency, then there will be no World War III. It would be a joke. It would be a hilarious joke, and it would be like the fall of Rome happened on 28 times speed. So, if we turn back to our initial statement, they're trying to start World War III. And why this is happening. The answer is very clear, which is that the Western Empire fundamentally sees World War III as inevitable. They won't let go of their position without a fight. They're not just going to say, okay, we're declining, China's rising, they're bigger than us at a certain point, so here you go. That they're not going to do that. They are fully intending on having as big a fight as possible, which is why they created NATO, and everything else they did, was to make sure that everything was on their side when eventually the next great imperial clash came. So if World War III is inevitable, it has to happen when the Western Empire is at its greatest advantage. If you wait and you're just declining and they're just getting stronger, then you're just making your own loss more inevitable. If you're declining and they're getting stronger, you just have to start the fight right now. Doesn't matter if it's good, doesn't matter if you're ready, it doesn't matter if you are actually able to sustain a worldwide war. If World War III is inevitable, then they need it to start when they still have an advantage. And it doesn't even matter if they do still have an advantage. If they're losing advantage and their opponent is gaining, then their only choice is now. Because, like I said, to them, World War III is inevitable. It's not something that they can, try to thread the needle. They're not concerned with that. Their advantage is military. And so they want to make it a military exchange. And so they will make sure World War III is inevitable. And they need to do it now while they have any hope at all. They have to do it now. I guess that's all I had to say. I'm going to make a meme video next time. Well, thank you guys for watching. Hopefully this is a little bit shorter than the other ones. I guess I'll find out once I edit it. But hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful or something. Anyway, good luck.